Meanwhile, the son, perhaps moved by a flicker of guilt or merely morbid curiosity, decided to return. His luxury SUV tore through the landscape, but the sight that awaited him chilled his blood. The elephant, once a gentle guardian, now loomed as an implacable judge. With a roar that shook the earth, the beast of the savannah charged, not at the man, but at the symbol of his escape and his cruelty. The powerful trunk descended with the force of lightning, crushing the SUV's hood, crumpling the gleaming metal into an unrecognizable mass. The luxury vehicle, once a refuge, was now a trap, a monument to his own ruin. The son, trapped and terrified, felt the psychological fear that nature imposed, a karmic punishment that left him at the mercy of the very fate he had wished upon his mother. The savannah, which he thought would be her tomb, became his own prison. The metallic thud echoed across the savannah, a death knell for luxury and impunity. The son, still stunned by the speed and fury of the attack, felt the impact reverberate through every fiber of his body. The SUV's hood, once a shield of polished steel, was now a twisted mass of metal, crushed against the engine with unimaginable force. The windshield, cracked into a web of 1,000 fragments, barely allowed a view of the terror that surrounded him. He was trapped. The steering wheel, once a symbol of control, now pinned him against the seat, a cage of iron and glass. The air inside the vehicle became rarefied, heavy with the smell of hot oil and the dread that emanated from him. The elephant, majestic and implacable, stepped back, its trunk still extended, as if savoring the destruction. Its eyes, once gentle when offering water to the elderly woman, now burned with cold intelligence and unshakable determination. It wasn't a blind attack of rage. It was a sentence. The animal seemed to understand the language of cruelty and responded with its own primal justice. The son tried to move, but the seatbelt, which once protected him, now bound him even more tightly to his ruin. He forced the door, but the impact had jammed it, transforming the exit into an insurmountable barrier. The engine, which should have roared at his command, was silenced, crushed, inert. The key, still in the ignition, turned lifelessly without response. The silence that followed the crash was even more terrifying, broken only by the sound of his own gasping breath and the frantic pounding of his heart. The elephant, with a disturbing calm, began to circle the SUV. Each step was a muffled thunder, each movement a declaration of power. The son, huddled in the seat, felt the giant's gaze piercing the shattered glass, stripping bare his guilty soul. It wasn't just an animal. It was the savannah incarnate, a judge and executioner. The irony was cruel. He had abandoned his mother to die of thirst and heat, and now he himself was at the mercy of a force of nature, trapped in his own instrument of escape. The sun, which once seemed an ally in his haste to escape, now became an enemy. The relentless rays penetrated the SUV's interior, transforming it into an oven. Sweat ran down his face, mingling with tears of despair. He screamed, a hoarse, pathetic sound that was lost in the vastness of the landscape. No one would hear him. No one would help him. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was preparing to be his own. The son's mind, once so focused on wealth and power, now wrestled with images of his mother, fragile and abandoned. He imagined the scorching heat, the excruciating thirst, the fear she must have felt. A pang of guilt, a feeling he had suppressed for decades, began to gnaw at his conscience, but it was late remorse born of fear, not compassion. The elephant stopped a few yards from the SUV and raised its trunk again, not to attack, but to sniff the air, as if assessing the situation, confirming the man's imprisonment. The son saw the intelligence in the animal's eyes, the certainty that its mission was accomplished. It didn't need to crush him. The savannah would do the rest. Night was approaching, and with it, the predators lurking in the shadows, drawn by the scent of fear and despair. The distant roar of a lion cut through the air, a chilling reminder of the dangers the darkness would bring. The elephant, with a final warning glance, turned slowly and began to walk away, disappearing into the tall vegetation. There was no triumph in its gait, only the calm of one who had fulfilled a duty. The sun, alone and helpless, watched the colossal silhouette vanish, leaving him with the twisted metal, the suffocating heat, and the echo of his own cowardice. The savannah, with its nocturnal sounds and its promises of danger, was ready to receive him. Karmic punishment had only just begun. He was trapped not just in the SUV, but in a nightmare he himself had created. The silence that followed the elephant's departure was not a relief, but an even more terrifying vacuum. The sun, huddled in the driver's seat, felt the air heavy and rarefied inside the crushed SUV. The smell of twisted metal, hot oil, and the cold sweat of his own dread filled his lungs, making each breath a struggle. His eyes, wide open, scanned the destroyed interior. The windshield shattered like a giant spiderweb, the doors jammed, the steering wheel that held him like a deadly embrace. He was trapped, a fly in a steel web, at the mercy of a savannah he had underestimated and desecrated. Outside, the sun began its relentless descent, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, a cruel beauty that mocked his misery. But with beauty came the promise of darkness, and with darkness, the nocturnal hunters. The sun tried to move again, a groan of frustration escaping his cracked lips. The seatbelt, tight against his chest, felt like iron, and his legs, pinned under the crumpled dashboard, refused to obey. Despair set in, a cold knot in his stomach. He closed his eyes for an instant, and the image of his mother, fragile and small, appeared in his mind. It wasn't an image of genuine love or regret, but a projection of his own fear. He had left her to die of thirst, and now thirst began to scratch his own throat. The heat inside the SUV was unbearable, transforming the vehicle into a metal oven. Every drop of sweat that ran down his forehead was a reminder of the punishment unfolding. The sounds of the savannah, once distant and exotic, now became palpable threats. The buzzing of insects, the rustling of dry leaves, the cawing of nocturnal birds beginning their shift, all seemed to conspire against him. He heard a closer rustle, a dragging sound in the tall grass, and his heart pounded. Was it just the wind, or something more? His imagination, once so focused on dollar signs and contracts, now painted vivid pictures of prey and predators. He tried to scream again, but his voice was hoarse, a pathetic whisper that was lost in the immensity. No one would hear him, no one would come. He was an insignificant speck of flesh and bone on the vast, indifferent carpet of nature. The irony was a bitter poison. He had fled civilization to rid himself of his responsibility, and now civilization itself had abandoned him, leaving him at the mercy of an older, more implacable justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthened, engulfing the landscape in a cloak of mystery and danger. The SUV's interior, once bathed in sunlight, sank into twilight, transforming into a dark, claustrophobic tomb. The sun felt the night's chill begin to seep in, a cruel contrast to the suffocating heat of the day, but equally menacing. His body, exhausted and dehydrated, began to tremble. The distant roar of a lion, once just an echo, now seemed closer, more real, a harbinger of horrors that darkness brought. He could almost smell the beast, the warmth of its breath, the hunger in its eyes. The image of the elephant, the gentle giant transformed into a judge, returned. The animal didn't need to kill him, it merely trapped him, leaving the savannah to finish the job. It was a slower, more agonizing punishment, a psychological torture that corroded his sanity with each passing minute. Hours dragged on, each seeming an eternity. Thirst intensified, his mouth dry, his tongue swollen. He licked his lips, but there was no moisture, only the metallic taste of fear. His eyes, now accustomed to the darkness, tried to discern shapes in the vegetation, but everything was an indistinct mass of dancing shadows. Any rustle, any snap was amplified in his mind, transforming into footsteps, into claws, into teeth. He thought of the water the elephant had offered his mother, the kindness of that gesture, and he, the son, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion. Guilt, once a whisper, now screamed in his mind, not for his mother, but for his own imminent doom. He was reaping what he sowed, and the harvest was bitter, full of terror and despair. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was preparing to be his own, and he was trapped, watching his own funeral slowly unfold under the starry, indifferent African sky. The cloak of the African night descended with relentless speed, swallowing the last vestiges of light and any hope it might carry. The sun, huddled in what remained of his luxury SUV, felt the air grow denser, colder, and infinitely more menacing. The silence that followed the elephant's departure was not a relief, but a deafening vacuum, filled only by the incessant buzzing in his ears and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He was alone, completely alone. The darkness was almost palpable, a thick curtain that transformed familiar shapes into shadowy monsters. The shattered windshield, once a spiderweb, now reflected the faint starlight like malevolent eyes watching him. Every rustle of dry leaf, every distant snap in the vegetation was amplified in his terrified mind, transforming into footsteps, into claws, into approaching teeth. Thirst was an excruciating torture, a rough sandpaper scraping his throat. He licked his cracked lips, but there was no moisture, only the metallic taste of fear and despair. His body, exhausted and dehydrated, began to tremble uncontrollably, a mixture of cold and dread. His legs, pinned under the crumpled dashboard, burned with a dull ache, and the seatbelt which should have protected him now pressed him against the seat, a cage of steel and guilt. The son's mind, once so sharp for business and manipulation, now became a battlefield. Images of his mother, fragile and small, flashed vividly, not as a lament of love, but as a mirror of his own misery. He had left her to die of thirst, and now thirst was his own executioner. He had abandoned her to the mercy of nature, and now nature was his judge and his tormentor. The irony was a bitter poison, corroding his sanity with each passing minute. A distant sound, a drawn-out, melancholic howl, tore through the silence. It was the song of jackals, or perhaps hyenas, announcing their arrival, drawn by the scent of fear and perhaps blood. The son held his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness, trying to discern any movement beyond the shattered glass. His imagination, once so focused on dollar signs and contracts, now painted vivid pictures of prey and predators, of sharp teeth and merciless claws. Hours dragged on, each seeming an eternity. The suffocating heat of the day had given way to a penetrating cold, but cold sweat still ran down his forehead, mingling with tears of despair. He smelled the damp earth, the wild vegetation, and now a new, more pungent, more animalistic smell seeping through the twisted metal. It was the smell of the hunt, the smell of approaching death. A closer rustle, more distinct, made his heart leap into his throat. It wasn't the wind. It was a slow, deliberate drag in the tall grass, a few yards from the SUV. He could almost feel the presence, the warmth of an invisible beast's breath in the darkness. Panic overwhelmed him, a primal terror that reduced him to a cornered animal. He cowered even further, trying to make himself as small as possible, wishing to merge with the cold, inert metal. The image of the elephant returned, the gentle giant transformed into a judge, its intelligent, implacable eyes. The animal didn't need to kill him. It merely trapped him, leaving the savannah to finish the job. It was a slower, more agonizing punishment, a psychological torture that corroded his sanity with each passing minute. Guilt, once a whisper, now screamed in his mind, not for his mother but for his own imminent doom. He was reaping what he sowed, and the harvest was bitter, full of terror and despair. The night advanced, and with it, the certainty that dawn would bring only a new form of torment. Thirst intensified, his mouth dry, his tongue swollen. His eyes, now accustomed to the darkness, tried to discern shapes in the vegetation, but everything was an indistinct mass of dancing shadows. Any rustle, any snap was amplified in his mind, transforming into footsteps, into claws, into teeth. The lion's roar was not just a sound, it was a primordial vibration that shook the twisted metal of the SUV, penetrating the son's bones and echoing in the hollow chamber of his chest. There was no more room for denial, for the self-delusion that had accompanied him throughout his life. That sound was the voice of the savannah, a final decree, sealing his fate with brutal certainty. Panic, once a wave that came and went, was now a cold ocean that engulfed him completely, paralyzing every fiber of his being. His eyes, wide in the darkness, tried in vain to pierce the veil of night, searching for the source of that terror, but the darkness was a living, dense entity that moved and breathed around him. The smell, the smell. Before, just the aroma of damp earth and wild vegetation. Now, a pungent and unmistakable odor seeped through the crumpled metal. It was the smell of the beast, a musky, warm, predatory scent, mingling with his own cold sweat and the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Every rustle of dry leaf, every distant snap in the vegetation was no longer a mere illusion. It was a confirmation, a step, a slow and deliberate drag that was approaching. The chorus of jackals and hyenas, once a distant lament, now seemed to have transformed into a macabre orchestra, whose sounds drew closer, announcing the arrival of the night's reapers, attracted by the scent of his vulnerability, his despair, his flesh. The son's mind, once a labyrinth of financial strategies and calculated manipulations, was now a chaotic battlefield. Images of his luxurious life, of expensive dinners and fast cars, flashed vividly, contrasting cruelly with the reality of his prison of twisted metal. The irony was a bitter poison that corroded his sanity. He had fled civilization to rid himself of his responsibility, and now civilization itself had abandoned him, leaving him at the mercy of an older, more implacable justice. The image of his mother, fragile and small, was no longer a lament of love, but a mirror of his own misery, an accusing ghost dancing in the shadows. He had left her to die of thirst, and now thirst was his own executioner, a rough sandpaper scraping his throat, transforming his tongue into a dry, swollen piece of leather. His body, exhausted and dehydrated, began to tremble uncontrollably, a mixture of penetrating cold and primordial dread. His legs, pinned under the crumpled dashboard, burned with a dull and constant ache, and the seatbelt, which should have protected him, now pressed him against the seat, a cage of steel and guilt. He tried to scream again, but his voice was hoarse, a pathetic whisper that was lost in the indifferent immensity of the savannah. No one would hear him. No one would come. He was an insignificant speck of flesh and bone on the vast and cruel carpet of nature, a sacrifice to his own arrogance. Then, a denser, more defined shadow began to emerge from the deeper darkness. It wasn't a trick of the starlight, nor a leaf dancing in the wind. It was a shape, large, heavy, moving with a deliberate, almost majestic slowness, but laden with deadly intent. The son held his breath, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode from his chest. He could feel the presence, the warmth of the invisible beast's breath in the darkness, a few yards from the SUV, A low, guttural growl vibrated in the air, a sound that was not a lion's, but something equally, if not more, terrifying in its proximity. The shape approached, and the sun's eyes, now more accustomed to the gloom, could discern the outline. It wasn't the lion, it was a hyena, enormous, with powerful shoulders and a jaw that could crush bones. It stopped a few paces from the SUV, its eyes glowing with a greenish, hungry light, fixed on him. There was no haste in its movements, only a calculating patience, the certainty that the prey was cornered. It sniffed the air, its head low, its large ears swiveling to catch every sound. The smell of fear was an irresistible invitation. The hyena began to circle the SUV, its steps dragging in the dry grass, a sound that seemed amplified 1,000 times in the sun's terrified mind. It stopped again, this time closer to the driver's door, where the metal was most twisted, further exposing the interior. The sun cowered even further, trying to make himself as small as possible, wishing to merge with the cold, inert metal. The hyena let out a low sound, almost a muffled laugh, a sound that pierced his soul and made him tremble uncontrollably. It was the sound of death mocking. The hyena's growl was not just a sound, it was a macabre promise, an invitation to the misfortune unfolding under the starry cloak of the savannah. The beast, with its powerful shoulders and eyes that glowed with an ancient hunger, was not in a hurry. It knew its prey was cornered, a gift from the night, bound in a cage of twisted metal. The sun, huddled in the driver's seat, felt every vibration of that growl in his bones, an echo of his own terror. The hyena took another step, and the animal's hot, fetid breath, laden with the smell of carrion and earth, seeped through the crack in the shattered glass, invading the tiny, suffocating space of the SUV. The sun closed his eyes, wishing the darkness would swallow him, make him disappear. But the darkness was the hyena's accomplice, a silent ally that amplified every sound, every smell, every frantic beat of his heart. The animal began to sniff the crumpled metal, its wet muzzle brushing the scratched paint, searching for an opening, a weak point. Its teeth, which could crush bones with ease, seemed to be inches from his flesh. The sun felt a chilling shiver run down his spine, not just from the night's cold, but from the certainty that death was there, palpable, waiting patiently. He tried to move, to somehow get away, but his pinned legs and the searing pain kept him immobilized, a broken doll at the mercy of its fate. Then, a sound, not a growl, but a muffled, guttural laugh that seemed to come from the depths of hell. It was the sound of the hyena, a cruel and mocking laugh that pierced the sun's soul, corroding the last remnants of his sanity. It was the sound of nature celebrating its own justice, a scorn for human arrogance. The hyena raised its head, its eyes fixed on his through the darkness. And the sun swore he saw a glint of malicious intelligence, an understanding of his suffering. Guilt, which had once been a distant whisper, now screamed in his mind, no longer for his imminent doom, but for the image of his mother. The same thirst that tortured him now he had imposed on her, the same loneliness, the same abandonment. The water the elephant offered his mother, a gesture of pure compassion, contrasted brutally with the savannah's indifference and the hyena's cruelty. He, the sun, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion, and now he was reaping the bitter harvest of his own inhumanity. The hyena took a step back, and the sun felt a brief relief, a false hope that the beast might give up. But no, it merely repositioned itself, its eyes still fixed on him. Then, with a sudden and powerful movement, it charged against the driver's door, where the metal was most twisted. A dull thud resonated through the SUV, making it shake violently. The sun let out a muffled scream of terror, the impact reverberating through his already aching body. The hyena was testing, searching for an entry, and he could feel the animal's brute force against the metal that separated him from death. The smell of blood, his own, now mingled with the smell of the beast, and the earth. A new wound had opened on his arm, where the twisted metal had hit him with the impact. The pain was sharp, but the fear was greater, a poison that paralyzed his senses. He tried to cower even further, wishing to be invisible, a ghost in the night. Suddenly, a rustle in the grass, more distant but unmistakable, a second and then a third guttural laugh, answering the first hyenas. The son's heart stopped. It wasn't just one. There were more. The chorus of jackals and hyenas, once a distant lament, now transformed into a macabre orchestra whose sounds drew closer, announcing the arrival of the night's reapers, attracted by the scent of his vulnerability, his despair, his flesh. The first hyena seemed to react to the calls, its hungry eyes briefly turning to the darkness from which the sounds came. It growled again, a sound of possession, of guaranteed prey. The son felt despair deepen, a bottomless pit of terror. He was trapped, injured, dehydrated, and now surrounded. The night advanced mercilessly, and with it the certainty that dawn would bring only a new form of torment if he lived to see it. Thirst intensified, his mouth dry, his tongue swollen. His eyes, now accustomed to the darkness, tried to discern shapes in the vegetation, but everything was an indistinct mass of dancing shadows. Any rustle, any snap, was amplified in his mind, transforming into footsteps, into claws, into teeth. He thought of the water the elephant had offered his mother, the kindness of that gesture, and he, the son, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was preparing to be his own, and he was trapped, watching his own funeral slowly unfold under the starry, indifferent African sky. The hyena's growl intensified, a prelude to what was to come. Karmic punishment had only just begun, and the African night was far from over. And now, shadows moved, and more pairs of greenish eyes began to emerge from the darkness, forming a merciless circle around the SUV. The African night was not just darkness. It was a heavy, living cloak, woven with the sounds and smells of imminent death. The son, huddled in the twisted SUV, felt the rarefied air grow even denser with the arrival of the new predators. The greenish eyes, once a solitary pair, now multiplied, forming a glittering, merciless ring around his metal tomb. Each pair of eyes was a promise of agony, each moving shadow, a hungry spectre. The guttural laugh of the first hyena was answered by a growing chorus, a chilling cacophony that seemed to come from all sides, echoing in the depths of his soul. It was not a laugh of joy, but of scorn, of triumph, the ancestral sound of the hunt coming to fruition. The son felt despair deepen, a bottomless pit of terror that swallowed him. He was trapped, injured, dehydrated, and now surrounded by a pack of nocturnal reapers, attracted by the scent of his vulnerability, his despair, his flesh. The hyenas were not in a hurry. They were the personification of the savannah's cruel patience. The first hyena, the largest, growled again, a sound of possession, of guaranteed prey, but its hungry eyes briefly turned to the darkness from which the sounds came. As if assessing the competition, the newcomers, leaner but equally menacing shapes, began to circle the SUV, their steps dragging in the dry grass, a sound that seemed amplified 1,000 times in the son's terrified mind. They sniffed the air, their heads low, their wet muzzles brushing the crumpled metal, searching for an opening, a weak point. The son felt the hot, fetid breath of each of them, the smell of carrion and earth invading the tiny, suffocating space of the SUV. Their teeth, which could crush bones with ease, seemed to be inches from his flesh. He tried to move, to somehow get away, but his pinned legs and the searing pain kept him immobilized, a broken doll at the mercy of its fate. The new wound on his arm, where the twisted metal had hit him with the previous impact, bled slowly, its metallic smell now mingling with the smell of the beast and the earth, an irresistible invitation to the predators. Suddenly, one of the smaller, bolder hyenas charged against the rear door of the SUV where the glass was completely shattered. A dull thud resonated, and the son heard the sound of claws scratching the upholstery, the twisted metal. He let out a muffled scream, the impact reverberating through his already aching body. The hyena was testing, searching for an entry, and he could feel the animal's brute force against the metal that separated him from death. Fear was greater than pain, a poison that paralyzed his senses. He tried to cower even further, wishing to be invisible, a ghost in the night. The other hyenas, emboldened, began to join the attack. One of them, with a dark spot on its ear, jumped onto the SUV's hood, its paws scratching the paint, its eyes fixed on the interior. The son could see his distorted reflection in the crumpled metal, a pathetic and defenseless figure. The animal's weight made the SUV sway, and the son felt a chill run down his spine. He was being surrounded, tested, and with each passing minute, the metal barrier seemed more fragile, more about to give way. Thirst intensified, his mouth dry, his tongue swollen, his throat scratching. He thought of the water the elephant had offered his mother, the kindness of that gesture. And he, the son, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was preparing to be his own, and he was trapped, watching his own funeral slowly unfold under the starry, indifferent African sky. Guilt, once a whisper, now screamed in his mind, not for his mother but for his own imminent doom. He was reaping what he sowed, and the harvest was bitter, full of terror and despair. The image of the elephant returned, the gentle giant transformed into a judge, its intelligent, implacable eyes. The animal didn't need to kill him, it merely trapped him, leaving the savannah to finish the job. It was a slower, more agonizing punishment, a psychological torture that corroded his sanity with each passing minute. The hyena's growls intensified, a prelude to what was to come. Karmic punishment had only just begun, and the African night was far from over. With each scratch on the metal, with each guttural laugh, the son felt a piece of his hope drain away. Dawn seemed a distant mirage, an impossible dream amidst that living nightmare. He was at the mercy of nature, a cornered prey, and the savannah, with its implacable laws, was ready to collect its debt. The heavy cloak of the African night tightened further, and the son, huddled in what remained of his luxury SUV, felt every fiber of his being scream in panic. The greenish eyes, once a glittering ring promising agony, now seemed to draw closer, each pair a sharp knife, piercing the darkness. The guttural laugh of the hyenas, that macabre chorus, was no longer just a sound. It was the soundtrack to his own end, a symphony of scorn that resonated in the depths of his soul. The hyena on the hood, with its dark spot on its ear, was not content to merely observe. Its hungry eyes, reflecting the faint starlight, were fixed on the vehicle's interior, on the pathetic and defenseless man he had become. It began to scratch the shattered windshield with its powerful claws, a screeching sound of glass and metal that made the son cower even further, his body trembling uncontrollably. Each scratch was a warning, a reminder that the barrier between him and death was increasingly tenuous. The animal's weight made the SUV sway, and the son felt a chill run down his spine, the sensation of being devoured alive, even before being touched. While the hyena on the hood tested the fragility of the glass, the others did not stand still. The largest of them, the first to appear, with its rough fur and powerful shoulders, sniffed the driver's door, where the metal was most twisted. Its wet muzzles brushed the crumpled steel, searching for a crack, an opening. The smell of carrion and earth, mixed with his own blood and sweat, invaded the tiny, suffocating space of the SUV. He could feel the hot, fetid breath of each of them, the promise of teeth that could crush bones with ease, seeming to be inches from his flesh. Suddenly, the hyena, attacking the rear door, where the glass was completely shattered, managed to force the metal a little further. A sharp, metallic screech cut through the air, and the son heard the unmistakable sound of a piece of upholstery being torn off. A muffled scream escaped his throat, the impact reverberating through his already aching body. The beast was gaining ground, and he could feel the animal's brute force against the metal that separated him from death. Fear was greater than pain, a poison that paralyzed his senses, transforming him into a statue of terror. He tried to cower even further, wishing to be invisible, a ghost in the night, but there was nowhere to go. His pinned legs were a cruel reminder of his immobility, and the searing pain in his arm, where the new wound bled slowly, was a beacon for the predators. The metallic smell of his own blood now mingled with the smell of the beast and the earth, an irresistible invitation to the nocturnal reapers. The other hyenas, emboldened by their companion's progress, intensified the attack. One of them, leaner but equally menacing, began to bite the front tire, tearing the rubber with its sharp teeth, a hissing, grotesque sound that added another layer to the symphony of terror. The SUV, already a twisted skeleton, trembled under the coordinated assault. The son could hear the tearing of metal, the snapping of plastics with each charge of the beasts. Thirst intensified, his mouth dry, his tongue swollen, his throat scratching as if it were full of sand. In his growing delirium, the image of the water the elephant had offered his mother returned, not as a comfort, but as a torture. The kindness of that gesture contrasted brutally with the savagery that surrounded him. And he, the son, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was preparing to be his own, and he was trapped, watching his own funeral slowly unfold under the starry, indifferent African sky. Guilt, once a distant whisper, now screamed in his mind, no longer for his imminent doom, but for the image of his mother. The same thirst that tortured him now he had imposed on her, the same loneliness, the same abandonment. The water the elephant offered his mother, a gesture of pure compassion, contrasted brutally with the savannah's indifference and the hyena's cruelty. He, the son, the human being, had denied even that basic compassion, and now he was reaping the bitter harvest of his own inhumanity. The image of the elephant returned, the gentle giant transformed into a judge, its intelligent, implacable eyes. The animal didn't need to kill him. It merely trapped him, leaving the savannah to finish the job. It was a slower, more agonizing punishment, a psychological torture that corroded his sanity with each passing minute. The hyena's growls intensified, a prelude to what was to come. Karmic punishment had only just begun, and the African night was far from over. A louder sound, a dry crack, made the son jump. The hyena on the hood had finally broken the windshield at one point, and a piece of shattered glass fell inside the SUV, landing dangerously close to his head. The beast shoved its muzzle through the newly created opening, its hungry eyes inches from his. The hyena's hot, putrid breath invaded what remained of his personal space, and the son felt pure, primal terror freeze his blood. He could see the sharp teeth, the wet tongue, the promise of a violent and painful death. The hyena growled, a low, menacing sound, and tried to force its head inside, but the space was still too small. However, its claws scratched the dashboard, tearing the leather and exposing the foam. The SUV swayed violently with the hyena's struggle to get in, and the son felt that the metal wouldn't hold much longer. With each scratch on the metal, with each guttural laugh, the son felt a piece of his hope drain away. Dawn seemed a distant mirage, an impossible dream amidst that living nightmare. He was at the mercy of nature, a cornered prey, and the savannah, with its implacable laws, was ready to collect its debt. Then a new sound. Not a hyena's laugh, nor the snap of metal. It was a deep, grave growl that made the hyenas pause for an instant, their eyes turning to the darkness beyond the SUV. The sun felt a different kind of shiver, a terror that did not come from the hyenas. It was something larger, more primitive. The hyenas, fearless nocturnal predators, seemed hesitant, their growls diminishing to a murmur. The air grew heavy, laden with a new threat. What could be so terrifying as to silence even the hyenas? The deep growl, which had silenced the hyenas, was not just a sound. It was a vibration that traveled through the earth, up the twisted metal of the SUV, and seeped into the sun's bones. It was a sound that spoke of ancestral power, of a force that would not bend, would not negotiate. The hyenas, once so audacious, now seemed like spectres of their former ferocity. Their greenish eyes, which an instant before promised agony, were wide with a fear that surpassed the desire to hunt. They retreated, not in disordered panic, but with an instinctive caution, their bodies tense, their muzzles sniffing the air with a different urgency. The sun, paralyzed, felt a new kind of terror, a cold, heavy terror that made the fear of the hyenas seem almost trivial. He didn't know what it was, but the nocturnal predator's reaction was sufficient testimony. The hyenas, which seemed invincible in their numbers and cruelty, now slinked into the darkness, their growls transformed into low, submissive whimpers. The hyena on the hood, which moments before was trying to force its way in, leaped from the vehicle with a yelp, disappearing into the night like a shadow. The others followed, their steps quick and silent, leaving behind only the smell of their presence and the echo of their dread. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the hyena's chorus. It was a silence laden with expectation, with an imminent threat that had not yet revealed itself. The sun held his breath, his ears ringing, trying to discern any sound in the vast darkness. His heart pounded erratically in his chest, a frantic drum that seemed about to burst. The pain in his arm and legs was a constant reminder of his vulnerability, his immobility. Then, a new sound. Not a growl, but a roar. A roar that made the ground tremble, that tore the veil of the African night with primordial fury. It was the sound of the king, the sound that announced the arrival of the supreme predator. The sun felt his blood run cold, the air thin in his lungs. He knew what it was. A lion. A gigantic, imposing shadow emerged from the darkness, its golden eyes glowing like embers in the gloom. It was a male with a dark, thick mane that framed its powerful face. Each step was deliberate, majestic, and the earth seemed to bow to its passage. The lion was not in a hurry. There was no urgency in its movements. It was the very personification of authority, the apex of the savannah's food chain. The lion stopped a few yards from the SUV, its head raised, sniffing the air. The smell of blood, of twisted metal, of human fear, must have been irresistible. Its eyes fixed on the SUV, and the sun felt completely exposed, naked before that brute force. It was as if the lion could see through the metal, through his flesh, to the terror that consumed him. His dry mouth, swollen tongue, scratching throat, all were forgotten before that sight. Thirst, pain, guilt, everything dissolved into absolute dread. The lion let out another roar, lower this time, almost a warning, a reminder of its presence and its dominance. The sound reverberated in the son's chest, making his internal organs tremble. He tried to cower even further, but he was trapped, immobilized, an easy offering for the king of the jungle. The image of the elephant returned, not as a judge, but as a messenger. The gentle giant had not killed him, but had delivered him to an even crueler fate, a punishment that unfolded in layers of terror. The lion took another step, then another, circling the SUV slowly. Its muscles rippled under its golden skin, each movement a demonstration of strength and grace. It stopped beside the driver's door, where the metal was most crumpled, where the sun was most exposed. The sun could feel the animal's hot, heavy breath, the wild smell of meat and earth. He could hear the soft sound of the lion's steps, the rustle of its mane against the metal. The lion's golden eyes met his, and the sun felt a chill that did not come from the night's cold, but from the certainty of death. There was no anger in those eyes, only nature's predatory indifference. He was just another prey, a resource. The savannah, which he thought would be his mother's tomb, was now preparing his own, and he was trapped, watching his own funeral unfold under the impassive gaze of the king of the night. Karmic punishment had reached its peak, and the African night was far from over. The lion lowered its head, sniffing the opening in the door, and the sun felt pure. Primordial terror froze his blood. He was at the mercy of nature, a cornered prey, and the king of the savannah was ready to collect its final debt. The lion lowered its head, its massive muzzle gently pushing against the twisted metal of the door. The sun felt the animal's hot, heavy breath, a smell that was a mixture of raw meat, earth, and something untamed. Filling the restricted space of the SUV, the golden eyes, once distant, were now inches from his, an abyss of indifference and power. There was no hatred, no anger, only primordial hunger, the cold logic of the food chain. The lion sniffed deeply, and the sun could feel the air being sucked into the predator's nostrils, as if the animal were absorbing every molecule of his fear. The lion's tongue, rough as sandpaper and wet, brushed the twisted metal of the door, a hissing, grotesque sound that made the sun's hairs stand on end, a shiver of repulsion and terror. He tried to recoil, but his body was trapped, every muscle locked by dread. The pain in his arm and legs, once so present, was now a distant hum, overshadowed by the imminent threat. The hyena on the hood had broken the windshield, but the lion, with its colossal strength, could tear off the entire door if it wanted, and he knew it. A low murmur, almost a purr, escaped the lion's throat, a guttural sound that vibrated through the SUV's chassis, reverberating directly in the sun's chest. It was not a sound of rage, but of recognition, of possession. The king of the savannah had found its prey, and there was no haste in its dominance. Slowly, with terrifying precision, the lion moved one of its front paws. The claws, long and sharp as razors, were retracted, but the sun could imagine them extended, tearing flesh and bone. The paw touched the crumpled metal of the door, and the sun felt the SUV tremble slightly under the weight and pressure. The lion was not attacking. It was investigating, testing, like a chef evaluating an ingredient. The sun closed his eyes for an instant, a silent plea for it all to end. But the end would not come so easily. The savannah, in its calculated cruelty, wanted him to witness every second of his own annihilation. The image of the elephant returned, no longer as a distant judge, but as the architect of his destiny. The gentle giant had not killed him, but had delivered him to an even crueler fate, a punishment that unfolded in layers of terror. The elephant had crushed the SUV, not just to prevent his escape, but to make it a perfect trap, a banquet on wheels for the night's predators. The lion withdrew its paw, and the sun opened his eyes, only to see the animal's head tilt slightly, as if pondering. Then, with a movement surprisingly quick for its size, the lion shoved its muzzle through the opening in the door, forcing the twisted metal to give way a little more. The putrid smell of its mouth invaded the SUV's interior, and the sun felt the warmth of the animal's breath on his face. The canine teeth, long and yellowish, were inches from his throat. He could feel the tip of one of them brush his skin, a chilling touch that promised death. A low growl, almost a purr, escaped the lion's throat, a sound that, despite its apparent calm, carried the promise of violence. The sun felt his entire body tremble uncontrollably. He was on the verge of collapse, his mind oscillating between brutal reality and the delirium of thirst and fear. He closed his eyes again, not in resignation, but in a primordial despair, awaiting the impact, the tearing of flesh, the end of his miserable existence. But the attack did not come. The lion remained there, its muzzle inside the SUV, its teeth close, but not biting. It was psychological torture, a demonstration of power. The lion was playing with its prey, prolonging the terror. The son could feel sweat running down his body, mixing with dried blood and dirt. Each beat of his heart was an echo of his mortality. Then a new sound, distant at first, but growing in intensity. A sound that was not from the savannah, nor from an animal. It was a mechanical sound, a low hum that seemed to come from the sky. The lion, which seemed so absorbed in its prey, raised its head, its ears moving like radar to catch the intrusive sound. Its golden eyes, once fixed on the sun, now turned to the night sky. The hum grew louder, more defined. It was the sound of rotors. A helicopter? In that place, at that hour. Hope, an emotion he thought he had forgotten, ignited a small flame in his chest, quickly suffocated by reality. Who would be looking for him? His father, perhaps. But his father didn't know where he was, and had no reason to look for him. The lion let out a louder growl, a sound of irritation. The presence of the flying machine was an interruption in its hunting ritual. It pulled its head back from the SUV, its eyes still fixed on the sky, where a small light began to flash in the darkness. The sound of the helicopter was approaching rapidly, and the son could feel the ground vibrate slightly. The savannah, which seemed so indifferent, now stirred with the arrival of this strange element. The lion, the king of the night, was being challenged by a machine. The son, trapped between imminent death and unlikely salvation, watched the drama unfold, a mere spectator in his own nightmare. Karmic punishment had reached its peak, but the African night and the son's fate were far from sealed. The helicopter, now more visible, with its navigation lights flashing like the eyes of a metallic predator, seemed like a giant insect in the sky, coming to disturb the wild order of the night. The lion, with a final disdainful glance at the SUV and its occupant, a look that seemed to say, "Your luck is temporary," let out a warning roar at the flying intruder. Then, with the same silent majesty with which it had arrived, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, its shadows merging with the African night. The sun was alone again, but no longer with the silence of the hyenas, but with the deafening sound of the approaching helicopter. The immediate threat of the lion had dissipated, but the uncertainty of what would come next was almost as terrifying. A new chapter of his nightmare about to be written. The sound of the helicopter intensified, a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the twisted metal sheets of the SUV and consequently through the son's bones. The air around him began to churn violently, raising a thick cloud of dust and dry leaves that whipped the crumpled metal. The navigation lights, once just distant points, transformed into powerful searchlights, sweeping the darkness of the savannah with dazzling intensity. The flying machine hovered above him, a monster of metal and noise, its rotors spinning furiously, creating an artificial wind that seemed to want to tear the SUV from the ground. The son squeezed his eyes shut, shielding himself from the dust and blinding light. Hope, that fragile flame that had ignited with the lion's escape, now struggled against a new kind of fear. Who were these people, and why were they here? His father, he knew, had no means of finding him, much less the intention. His friends were merely parasites who wouldn't care about his whereabouts. The idea that someone was looking for him out of concern seemed absurd, almost laughable, given his own selfish nature. The helicopter began to descend slowly, the rotor noise becoming deafening, drowning out any other sound from the savannah. The dust turned into a sandstorm, and the sun smelled the acrid scent of kerosene mixed with the dry, hot air. The machine landed a few dozen yards from the SUV, a rough landing that made the ground tremble beneath him. The rotors gradually slowed, the sound diminishing to a low but still powerful hum that echoed in the night. Then the helicopter doors opened. Two figures, clad in dark uniforms and equipped with vests and backpacks, jumped out. They carried powerful flashlights that cut through the darkness, and the sun could see the metallic glint of weapons at their hips. They were not civilians, nor did they look like a common rescue team. They looked like rangers or perhaps military personnel. Their movements were calculated, professional, sweeping the terrain with caution and an air of authority. One of the figures raised a radio to his mouth, speaking in a language the sun didn't understand, but which sounded urgent and authoritative. The other figure pointed towards the SUV, and both flashlights fixed on it, trapping the sun in a blinding beam of light. He tried to raise his hand to shield his eyes, but the searing pain in his arm prevented him, a cruel reminder of his vulnerability. The two men began to approach, their steps firm and decisive, crushing the dry vegetation under their boots. The sun could feel his heart pounding in his chest, an erratic beat of fear and uncertainty. The lion's threat had been primal, visceral, the most basic struggle for survival. This new threat was different, more calculated, more human, and somehow more terrifying. He was injured, dehydrated, and now at the mercy of armed strangers whose intentions were a mystery. "Hello," one of the men shouted in English, his voice deep and authoritative, muffling the helicopter's residual hum. "Is anyone there? Come out with your hands up." The sun tried to respond, but his throat was dry and hoarse, like sandpaper. A guttural, unintelligible sound escaped his cracked lips. He tried to move his hands, but the pain was unbearable, and his left arm was pinned under the twisted steering wheel. A perfect trap. The men approached even closer, their flashlights focused on the SUV's interior. They saw the deplorable state of the vehicle, the shattered windshield, the crumpled and torn metal, and finally, the sun, trapped and bleeding, a picture of misery. "He's injured," the first man said, this time in a lower but still tense tone. "Looks like the SUV was attacked, or crushed." The second man knelt, examining the trail of destruction around the vehicle. He noticed the gigantic marks on the ground, footprints that were not from any tire, but from an animal of colossal proportions. His eyes widened in recognition. "Elephant," he murmured almost to himself, a tone of astonishment in his voice. "An elephant did this." The first man, who seemed to be the leader, pointed the flashlight directly at the son's face, forcing him to flinch. "Who are you? What happened here? Where's the rest of your team?" The son tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. Thirst was overwhelming, a constant agony, and the pain in his body was returning with full force now that the adrenaline from the encounter with the lion had subsided. He felt his head spin, and darkness began to invade his peripheral vision, threatening to engulf him. "Water," he managed to whisper, his voice a mere almost inaudible breath. The men exchanged glances. Distrust was palpable. A luxury SUV, destroyed by an elephant in the middle of nowhere, with an injured and dehydrated man. It wasn't a common sight. They were anti-poaching rangers, accustomed to encountering dangerous and illegal situations. The presence of such an expensive vehicle in a remote area, without apparent authorization, raised many red flags. "He needs water," the second ranger said, with a more compassionate but still cautious tone. "And first aid. It looks like he was attacked by a lion, too. See the claw marks on the metal and the smell." The leader nodded, keeping his weapon ready, his eyes fixed on the sun. "Okay, but carefully. We don't know who he is. He could be a poacher or worse." He approached the SUV, maintaining a safe distance. "Can you move? Try to get out of the vehicle slowly, hands visible." The son shook his head weakly, exhaustion and pain overwhelming him. "Trapped! Arm!" The leader sighed, a sound of frustration. "Right, we'll have to get him out. Stay calm. Don't make any sudden movements." The second ranger took a water bottle from his backpack and approached cautiously, offering it to the son. The smell of water was intoxicating, and the son tried to reach for it desperately, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. The ranger poured a little water on his lips, and the son drank avidly, feeling life slowly return to his veins, a momentary relief. It was the water he had denied his mother, and now, ironically, it was being offered to him by strangers, in the same implacable wilderness. While drinking, his eyes swept the dark savannah. The lion had disappeared, but the memory of its golden eyes and warm breath still haunted him. And the elephant, the gentle giant who had sealed his fate. He wondered where his mother was. Was she safe? Had the elephant protected her? Guilt, which had been momentarily stifled by terror, now returned with overwhelming force, an unbearable weight on his conscience. The rangers began to assess the best way to get him out of the SUV. They spoke in their native language, and the son could only catch a few scattered words, but the tone was serious, a mixture of concern and suspicion. He knew he was in trouble, not just physically, but legally. The story he would have to tell would be a web of lies, and he doubted they would believe a word. Karmic punishment continued, relentless. He had escaped the lion, but now he was in the hands of human justice, or at least the law of the savannah, which did not forgive transgressions. And the savannah he had learned the brutal way did not forget. The helicopter, which seemed like salvation, was just another instrument in his judgment. The son closed his eyes, exhausted but unable to find peace. The African night was far from over, and dawn would bring with it a new kind of reckoning. He was trapped, not just in the SUV, but in a web of consequences he himself had woven with his own hands. The dry savannah air seemed to compress as the rangers approached the twisted SUV. The leader, with his grave voice, gave orders in a language the son didn't understand, but whose tone left no room for doubt. The situation was serious. The second ranger, more compassionate but still vigilant, offered more water, and the son drank with an avidity that bordered on desperation, feeling his throat scratch and life, or what was left of it, trickle from his cracked lips. Each sip was a bitter reminder of the water he had denied his mother, an echo of the cruelty that now turned against him. The leader, a man of robust build and penetrating gaze, gestured to the son's trapped arm. He and the second ranger began to assess the best way to free him. The SUV's metal, once a symbol of luxury and power, was now a cage of torture, its crumpled and jagged sheets pinning the son like an insect in a web. The smell of kerosene mingled with sweat, blood, and dust, creating a suffocating atmosphere. "We'll need tools," the leader said in English, his voice cutting through the helicopter's hum. "The metal is too deformed. He's really stuck." The second ranger, who seemed to be the first aid specialist, took a kit from his backpack. He tried to examine the son's arm, but the position was impossible. The pain was excruciating, a constant throb radiating from his shoulder to his fingers, now swollen and purplish. The son groaned, a low, hoarse sound that barely escaped his throat. "Don't move," the ranger instructed, his voice softer. "We'll get you out of here. Bear the pain. Bear the pain." The irony was palpable. He had inflicted pain on his own mother, leaving her to die under the merciless sun. And now it was he who was at the mercy of nature and humanity. The savannah, he realized, was not just a place of wild beauty, but an implacable judge, a mirror reflecting his own atrocities. One of the rangers returned to the helicopter and came back with a toolbox. The metallic sound of wrenches and pliers being taken out seemed amplified in the night. They began to work, trying to pry open the steering wheel and dashboard that trapped the son's arm. Each movement, each groan of the metal sent waves of agony through his body. He gritted his teeth, biting his lip until he tasted the metallic tang of his own blood, trying not to scream. "Who are you?" the leader asked again, as he worked with an iron bar, trying to create space. "What were you doing here with an SUV like this? This isn't a tourist area." The son tried to formulate a response, a convincing lie. But his mind was clouded by pain and exhaustion. The words jumbled, and he could only murmur something about being lost and an accident. The excuses sounded hollow, even to him. The leader paused for a moment, his flashlight sweeping the SUV's interior. His eyes lingered on some luxury objects that had survived the destruction. An expensive watch, a gold ring, the leather wallet that was on the center console with some high-value notes and credit cards. The incongruity between the miserable man and the luxurious possessions was striking. "An accident, you say?" the leader retorted, a tone of skepticism in his voice. "And an elephant crushed your SUV? And where's your team, your companions?" The mention of the elephant brought to the son's mind the image of the giant, its wise gaze, its trunk offering water to his mother, and then the fury, the revenge, the crushing of the SUV. He shuddered. There was no way to explain that. The truth was too absurd, and the lies were pathetic. I was alone," he managed to say, his voice weak. My mother." He hesitated. Telling about his mother would mean admitting his crime. What if she was alive? What if the elephant had taken her to a safe place? The idea that she could be well while he suffered was an even greater torment. "Your mother?" the second ranger asked, pausing his work for an instant. "Where is your mother?" The son closed his eyes, a solitary tear rolling down the corner of his eye. I don't know. She got lost." The lie was fragile, transparent. The rangers exchanged meaningful glances. They were accustomed to excuses, to fabricated stories by poachers and criminals trying to get away. The son's story, with his luxury SUV destroyed by an elephant and a lost mother, sounded like another one of them. Lie, with a last painful screech of metal, the son's arm was freed. A cry of pain escaped his lips, and he fainted for a brief moment, darkness engulfing him. When he opened his eyes again, he was being pulled out of the SUV, his body protesting with every movement. His arm hung limply, a sharp, constant pain pulsing in his veins. He was laid on the dusty ground, and the second ranger began to examine his arm and other abrasions. The pain was intense, but the feeling of being free from the SUV's confinement was a small relief. He smelled antiseptic and felt the bandage being applied, a professional but cold touch. "He's lucky to be alive," the second ranger murmured to the leader, in their native language. "Looks like the lion left him, but the elephant did a number on him, and the claw marks on the metal. A lion attack for sure." "Yes, lucky," the leader replied, emotionless. "But his luck may have run out. This man is a mystery, a luxury SUV abandoned in a restricted area, and a story that makes no sense. He's coming with us." The son, semi-conscious, heard the words lucky and mystery. He knew he was in serious trouble. The justice of the savannah, which had manifested through the elephant and the lion, was now being complemented by human justice. He had escaped death, but not responsibility. They helped him up, or rather dragged him. Each step was torture, his injured arm swinging uselessly. The helicopter lights seemed to swallow him, and the sound of the rotors, which once was a promise of salvation, now sounded like a drum roll in a courtroom. As they approached the aircraft, the son noticed more figures emerging from the darkness, all in similar uniforms, armed and with serious expressions. It wasn't a rescue, it was an apprehension. He was a prisoner, not a victim. He was pushed into the helicopter, his aching body protesting. The interior was cramped, full of equipment and with the strong smell of fuel. As he was strapped into a seat, his eyes swept the dark savannah one last time. The lion had disappeared, the elephant too. But their legacy remained, etched in the destroyed SUV and in the son's tormented soul. The guilt for his mother, the physical pain, the fear of the unknown, everything mingled in a whirlwind of emotions. The helicopter began to lift off, the deafening sound of the rotors cutting through the night. He was being taken away from the savannah, but not away from its consequences. The African night, which had witnessed his crime and his punishment, was far from over. And dawn, he knew, would bring an even more implacable reckoning. The helicopter tore through the savannah's darkness, a metallic monster that swallowed the sun in its noisy belly. Every vibration of the aircraft sent waves of agony through his injured arm, a searing pain that mingled with the deafening hum of the rotors. He was strapped to the seat, his body exhausted and his mind in tatters. The savannah, once a hell, now seemed a distant paradise compared to the uncertainty that awaited him. His eyes, heavy and swollen, tried to adjust to the gloom of the helicopter's interior, lit only by dashboard lights and the occasional flashlight of a ranger. The other passengers, the rangers who had apprehended him, maintained an austere silence, their faces hardened by the seriousness of the situation. There was no compassion in their gazes, only the cold determination of those fulfilling a duty. He was an anomaly, a problem to be solved. Guilt, which had been a whisper, now screamed in his mind. The image of his mother, fragile and abandoned, superimposed itself on the vision of the elephant, the wise giant who had sealed his fate. He had mocked life, family, nature itself, and now nature and humanity united to exact the price. The irony was a slow poison, corroding what remained of his soul. He tried to focus on the physical pain, to use it as a shield against the avalanche of remorse and fear. But it was useless. The pain in his arm was just a symptom of a much deeper wound, a moral wound that seemed incurable. The smell of kerosene and sweat in the helicopter mingled with the metallic odor of his own blood, a nauseating cocktail that made him want to vomit. The flight seemed endless. Every minute was an eternity. Every mile traveled took him further from the crime scene, but closer to the reckoning. He wondered where they would take him. A police station? A savannah prison? The prospect of being thrown into a dark cell, far from his world of luxury and privilege, was almost as terrifying as the death he had escaped. Suddenly, the helicopter began to descend. The dark landscape outside began to take shape, distant lights flickering on the horizon. It was a ranger station, a small oasis of civilization amidst the wild vastness. The son's heart pounded, a frantic drum in his chest. The moment of truth was approaching. The landing was abrupt, and the impact sent another wave of pain through his arm. The rotors slowed, and the deafening sound was replaced by a heavy silence, which seemed to amplify every beat of his heart. The helicopter door opened, and the strong glare of floodlights blinded him for an instant. He was unstrapped and pulled out, stumbling. The ground was beaten earth, and the air, though still dry, was different, with the smell of campfire smoke and something else, a smell of bureaucracy, of authority. Several uniformed figures approached, their faces serious and questioning. He was the center of attention, but not in the way he was accustomed to. "Bring him to the infirmary," a firm voice said in English. And then, "To the interrogation room. We need answers." He was led to a small building where a medic examined his arm with a look of professional concern. The fracture was evident, and the medic shook his head. "He'll need surgery, and soon," he murmured. "But we can stabilize him for now." The pain was eased with an injection, and the son felt a gentle fog begin to envelop his mind. As the medic worked, he heard fragments of conversation. "The SUV is completely destroyed, lion claw marks, and the elephant. It's quite a story. And the mother? He says she got lost. No signs of her in the immediate area, but we'll send a search team at dawn." The mention of his mother hit him like lightning. A search team. What if they found her? What if she was alive? The idea, which was once a torment, now transformed into a chilling dread. If she was alive, she would tell the truth. And the truth would be his complete ruin. After his arm was immobilized and some abrasions cleaned, he was taken to a small Spartan room. A metal table, 2 chairs, a lamp hanging from the ceiling. The air was heavy and the silence oppressive. The leader of the Rangers, the same man who had rescued him, entered, accompanied by another officer, both with penetrating gazes. "Now let's talk, sir," the leader said, sitting at the table. "Your name is—" The son tried to clear his throat. I am." The words seemed stuck. He had rehearsed lies, but now, under the cold, inquisitive gaze of the officers, they seemed to disintegrate. "We know who you are," the other officer intervened, his voice calm but laden with authority. He had an open file in front of him. "Your name is Son's name, a known businessman. Your SUV was tracked by satellite to this restricted area. What were you doing here, and where is your mother, Mrs. Mother's name?" The file, the tracker. They knew there was no escape. The web of lies he had tried to weave was unraveled before it even began. Panic began to set in. I got lost," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "It was an accident. The elephant. It attacked." The leader raised an eyebrow. "An elephant crushed your luxury SUV in a restricted area, and your 85-year-old mother got lost in the middle of the savannah, in an SUV that, by the way, only had room for the driver and no luggage for a long trip." The question hung in the air, a silent and devastating accusation. The son felt cold sweat run down his forehead. They had noticed. They had inspected the SUV. They knew there was no room for his mother, nor for her belongings. The truth, the naked and cruel truth of his abandonment, was about to be unearthed. He looked at the officers, at the lamp that swayed slightly above his head, at the cold metal table. The savannah had taught him a brutal lesson, and now human justice was ready to apply the punishment. He had escaped the lion, the elephant, but not responsibility. The African night, he realized, was far from over, and dawn would bring with it an even more implacable reckoning. He was trapped, no longer in the SUV, but in a web of consequences he himself had woven with his own hands, and this time there was no elephant to crush his escape. He was trapped, no longer in the SUV, but in a web of consequences he himself had woven with his own hands, and this time there was no elephant to crush his escape. The silence in the room was a weight, each second stretching like an eternity under the penetrating gaze of the officers. The lamp, swaying slightly, cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock his former life of light and luxury. Cold sweat ran down his forehead, mingling with the dust and the smell of antiseptic that still emanated from his bandaged arm. The physical pain was a constant, a cruel reminder of his vulnerability. But the pain settling in his soul was infinitely worse. He had underestimated the savannah, the animals, and now the intelligence and persistence of human justice. "Sir," the leader of the Rangers began again, his voice calm, but with unquestionable authority, "let's be clear. Your SUV is an exclusive model designed for a single person. There is no room for significant luggage, much less for an 85-year-old woman. Where exactly would your mother have been sitting, and where would her belongings have been for a trip, even a short one?" The question hung in the air, a rhetorical trap from which he could not escape. He tried to formulate a response, but the words dissolved in his throat. The truth was a monster he had tried to bury under layers of selfishness and lies, but now he was digging his own grave. She was in the back seat," he stammered, knowing it was a pathetic lie. The SUV had no back seat. It was a performance vehicle, not a family car. The other officer, the one with the file, closed it with a dry snap that echoed in the room. "Sir, we have your vehicle specifications. There is no back seat. There's no way your mother was there. And even if there was, there are no signs that she was even in the SUV. No belongings, no traces." The accusation was clear, implacable. They weren't just questioning his story, they were dismantling it piece by piece. The son felt panic set in, a chilling cold that crept up his spine. He had thought of everything, how to get rid of his mother, how to fabricate a story of an accident, but never how the very materiality of the SUV would betray him. I left her at a camp before, he tried, desperate, and went to get supplies. When I came back, she had disappeared. The leader raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. A camp in a restricted area, without permission, without an entry or exit record, and your 85-year-old mother disappeared from a camp in the middle of the wild savannah without a trace, while you were getting supplies in an SUV that was found miles from any refueling point. Every word was a blow, every question a stake driven into his defenses. He was a businessman, accustomed to manipulating facts and people, but here, in the rawness of the savannah and under the implacable light of the law, his tactics were useless. He was just an injured man, cornered by his own choices. The elephant. It attacked me, he insisted, trying to shift the focus to the part of the story that was, at least in part, true. I was trying to get back to her, but it destroyed the SUV. Yes, the elephant. The second officer intervened, his voice harsher now. An animal that, for some reason, crushed your luxury vehicle and left you injured, but alive. And the lion. The claw marks on the metal are unmistakable. A lion attacked you too. It seems the savannah wasn't too happy with your presence, sir. The irony was cutting. The savannah, which he had seen as a mere backdrop to his cruel plan, had become his executioner. The elephant, the lion, nature itself had risen against him, and now humanity, in the form of these officers, was finishing what nature had begun. Sir, the leader leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his. We have a search team preparing for dawn. They will scour the area where your SUV was found and beyond. If your mother is there, we will find her, alive or not. And when we find her, the truth will come out. An 85-year-old woman, abandoned, without water, without food, under the scorching savannah sun. That's not getting lost, sir. That's something else. The mention of the search team, the prospect of his mother being found, brought a new wave of dread. If she was alive, she would tell everything. The image of her, fragile, dehydrated, but alive, testifying against him, was a more terrifying scenario than any lion or elephant. And if she was dead, guilt would be an unbearable burden, an eternal condemnation. He felt a knot in his throat, his eyes welling up. His arm throbbed, his head spun. The luxury, the power, the arrogance that had defined him all his life, everything had crumbled in a matter of hours. He was no longer the untouchable businessman. He was a broken man, confronted with the monstrosity of his own actions. I didn't mean to, he began, his voice choked, but the words died in his throat. There was no excuse, no justification. The leader of the Rangers leaned back in his chair, watching him with an expression of disappointment. Didn't mean to what, sir? Didn't mean for her to be a burden. Didn't want to share your inheritance. The savannah has a peculiar way of revealing people's true nature, and yours, it seems, has been exposed in a brutal way. Silence reigned again, but now it was different. It was not a silence of questioning, but of condemnation. The son looked at the lamp, at the table, at his own clenched fists. He was naked, exposed, defenseless. The African night, which had witnessed his crime and his near death, was now setting the stage for his judgment. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was nowhere left to run. The truth, like a patient predator, had finally caught up with him. Dawn brought with it not only the implacable savannah sun, but also the confirmation of his worst fears. The search team, composed of experienced rangers and native trackers, set out even before sunrise. Hours later, the news arrived, not by radio, but by the arrival of an ambulance and a second patrol SUV. The son, still in the interrogation room, with a pale face and bloodshot eyes, watched through the small barred window. He saw the stretcher being carefully removed from the vehicle, and on it, fragile, but visibly alive, was his mother. Her white hair was tangled, her skin marked by the sun, but her eyes, though tired, carried an unshakable flame. Beside her, one of the rangers carried a water canteen, and the sight of her drinking, with a trembling hand, was a punch to the son's gut. She was alive, and worse, she would be able to speak. The leader of the rangers re-entered the room, now with a grave and definitive expression. "Your mother has been found, sir, a few miles from your SUV near a small seasonal stream, dehydrated, exhausted, but alive." And she told a story. The air in the room seemed to thin. The son felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. She's okay," he managed to ask, his voice almost a whisper, a last pathetic attempt to show some concern. The officer looked at him with contempt. "She's recovering. And yes, she's well enough to tell us exactly what happened. She described how she was left, how you abandoned her. She described the thirst, the despair, and she described how she was saved." Here, the officer's voice took on a tone of astonishment and reverence. She said an elephant found her, a gentle giant. It protected her, guided her to water, and somehow kept her safe until our team found her. An elephant, sir. The same one that apparently didn't much care for your luxury SUV and your intentions. The irony was poison. The animal he had tried to blame for his accident was the same one that had saved his mother's life. The elephant, a symbol of the savannah's wisdom and memory, had become the guardian of justice. The lady also mentioned that the elephant crushed your SUV after you left her, the other officer added with a dry smile. "It seems it didn't want you to come back to get her." The web of lies was not just unraveled, but pulverized. There was nowhere left to run. The savannah had spoken through its animals and its own resilience, and now the voice of his mother, rescued from the brink of death, would be the final testimony. "Sir," the leader of the Rangers said, standing up, "based on your mother's testimony, the evidence found at the scene, and your own contradictions, you are formally arrested on charges of abandonment of a vulnerable person, with the aggravating factor of endangering life and trespassing in a protected area. There are other charges that will be investigated, including attempted fraud." The handcuffs clinked. The sound was a requiem for his old life. The son did not resist. He was exhausted, broken. The image of the elephant, majestic and protective, contrasted brutally with his own smallness and cruelty. As he was led out of the room into the dazzling light of the African dawn, he felt the weight of guilt, not just of the law, but of nature itself. The savannah, with its wild beauty and its implacable justice, had collected its price. He had sought wealth and freedom, but found only imprisonment and condemnation. And his mother, whom he had tried to erase from his life, would live to witness his downfall, a living reminder that not every crime can be buried under the dust of the savannah. Justice sometimes comes in slow, heavy steps, like those of an elephant, but it always arrives.